change of the system and care of the soul. I think that part of what needs to happen is that people bring their diversity to a particular space, bring who they are, whatever social location it happens to be, and have open and honest dialogue about these things. You know, I think that it is important, let's say, for us, for brothers to come together and to talk about our patriarchy in some ways. And the same, I think, could be true for other groups of power, to just have some open and honest conversation about where they are on whatever continuum that may be, racist and inclusive, you know, misogynist and you know, humanist, like wherever you are on that spectrum. But I just think that we have to also create spaces where we're having the dialogue, because laws change, but you have to also be interested in changing people, right? Because it is very clear that somebody can get in office and undo the policy that you have helped to change. And so how do you do the work of changing people in the process of changing policy? And I think conversations have to be a starting place.
Absolutely.
I think churches and faith communities can be great venues for having those robust, tough conversations, and not going around to how can we be kumbaya and come together, but no, having some very serious conversation about this is how I was raised, and this is how my mama taught me to think about people of color. This is what my daddy told me about men who were gay, right? And to have these open conversations about where you are and to think about where you need to get to.
Right.
I would also say, I mean, on a day that you're feeling especially audacious, I would go to a meeting of one of the hate groups and just hear how they think. I mean, that will absolutely change the way that you think about, you know, the other. If the other is not, if you're not the one that's in the hate group, it would really behoove you to understand how they think.
Thank you.
I would like to build on the suggestion of books and resources by recommending a very slim volume written by Kentuckian Bell Hooks. It's called Feminism is for Everybody.
Yeah.
And she writes extraordinarily well, so anything she writes would be worth a look.
Yeah.
I would also like to turn your attention to something that you can access on the internet or visit live in person in Brooklyn. It's called The Dinner Party. And within that body of work that was a collaboration between Judy Chicago and about 500 women, the history of women from primordial goddess to Hatshepsut to Sojourner Truth to Georgia O'Keeffe is contained in that wonderful artwork that has its own woman-designed architect space. It's a celestial space. So if you have the chance to be there live, go to it, but the internet contains in a vital way as well what is the history in that artwork. And then lastly, if you feel so inclined tomorrow morning, a friend of mine will be preaching at Church of the Advent. It's an Episcopal church right outside of Cave Hill Cemetery in the Highlands. And this woman is a social justice-based preacher, but she has previously been able to preach within the church of her birth, and that's been denied. So she is now called into ministry in a different faith tradition because she's no longer, she did, but is no longer able to go to the pulpit in the faith tradition she was born to.
It's a common occurrence, sadly.
May I add to suggestion that Larry Wilmore's show, who took Stephen Colbert's place, last week, for instance, in his panel, because someone wrote an article about Hillary Clinton and what post-menstrual women are less of a threat. I think that's what the article was about. So Larry Wilmore, in his show with 3 women, talked about post-menstrual women. When do you ever hear that? Anyway, it was quite, so Larry Wilmore's show on Comedy Central, taking the place of Stephen Colbert, is very insightful and pushes the envelope. My observation then, or question for this rich banquet, is number one, what would it be like if we were all if you were this side of the aisle, was all fundamentalist clergy. If you were talking to them, because kind of you're preaching to the choir, I think, more or less here. Yeah. That's one question. The other is, when you're talking about women, learning from women, I'm wondering how many black men would be willing to listen to black gay men who, as a gay man, understand that I can be more in touch with my feminine side. So would a straight black men be at all willing to learn from the gay black men in their congregation who would not have to hide being gay and hide being their feminine side? How many black men would be willing to learn from them and be in connection with their own femininity?
I don't know that a fundamentalist audience would change anything that any of us have said, because I feel that we've all shown up in very authentic ways. I think that the energy in the room would be very different, which might change the course of the conversation a little bit. But I do think that part of what it means to be prophetic is to have a consistent message, right? Across contexts, right? I mean, and that's not to say that you don't do the work of contextualizing the message, but the message is essentially the same. And that's that we all got to ask for forgiveness, okay, in the course of all this injustice.
Right. And I think that I agree that, yeah, I would give this, I think I would have been just as candid, or however I was received. I think I would have performed the exact same. But I also think that there's this fallacy around the unnecessariness of preaching to the choir. Because even the choir needs to be reminded. But not only that, the choir needs to be pushed to go deeper. Because you never stop doing this work of overcoming what has been drilled into us as Americans, drilled into us as people. And you have to always be in the process of doing that. And I get really nervous when I think, and this is personally, I get really nervous if I think I've arrived at a particular place.
That's right.
I, as a prophet, cannot allow any of us to think that we've ever arrived at a particular place, particularly when it comes to how we have internalized the toxic logic that has just been presented to us everywhere we go. Their message of women inferiority and black inferiority and homosexual inferiority, that we always need those other reminders as well. Because there's no shortage of the people who spread the hate don't take a day off, so we can't take a day off.
I wish I could be a prophet. I'm a wannabe prophet. I'm more so of a priest in that I work, I'm a pastor. And so my day-to-day work includes the very real spiritual and sometimes temporal care of human beings and leading worship 5 times a week. The challenge with that is we're often in the throes of doing church, and we never stop to actually have conversations about our ideologies, about our theology, about in a way that expands our theology. So I think that every religious tradition probably could do a better job of having these kind of conversations that will really inspire growth among us, growth of thought and growth of practice.
And I don't wholly remember the second part of the question, but I get checked regularly for my heterosexism, which comes off sometimes. Right? You know, I think that I can easily. There are those times where I can think, the man and wife thing, that's normal to me. And sometimes it can become normal in my language as well, particularly public discourse. When you try to give examples, you want to give balanced examples, but sometimes my examples are heteronormative. And I mean, I do have one of my best friends in life. He is a same-gender loving pastor who checks me on that. So I think having that relationship, which also again goes to speaking to the choir, that sometimes he has to check me when I'm not giving a full view of the human experience. So I need those checks sometimes, and there is a benefit, I think, that you know, the heterosexual brother pastors can benefit from those thick conversations with our LGBTQ folk. You know?
We'll do one more question right here.
Hi, my name's Jewel. I'm from right here in Louisville. I very much wanted to thank you all for being here, first of all, because I've really enjoyed this conversation. I need to ask, the poetry, the second one she read about teaching the daughter to drive and the other things that child needs to be aware of. As a white person, I am ashamed of the sins of my forefathers. And I feel that whenever I'm around people of color, and I don't know how to overcome that. Are there talks happening on the other side that are telling the children that plenty of white people are good and don't have these problems and aren't here to condemn them or arrest them or shoot them, and that it's okay to play with my children because I have raised colorblind children?
I don't know that the conversation is necessarily tilted at a disdain for the dominant culture or white people. But I think the conversation is really rooted in a need to protect Black and brown children. That these are, I mean, it's just the facts of life. And so I don't know that even the outgrowth of it, I wouldn't say, is a dislike, a disdain, a hatred for white people, or even the creation of a feeling that, you know, white people are bad. But it's just when you come into contact with authority bearers in our society, there is a certain way that you must govern yourself.
Yeah, I don't think that we even have the luxury of thinking about hating white people in this country. But beyond that, I think that the message is always about, you know, the negative effects of white supremacy, which transcends white people. Right? We're talking about a logic that sees, that suffocates, to use Cornel West's language. It's a logic that suffocates Black beauty, Black creativity, Black freedom, right? That's a particular logic. That's not a person. Now, that logic can inhabit particular bodies. And so I think that part of it is connected to safety, but even the broader conversations about racism in this country, at least the way I have them and the way it was had with me from my family, was never against individual white people. But it is against the fact that a system exists, a logic exists that devalues who I am because of my skin color, which I think is an important conversation for me. Definitely a conversation I plan on having with my niece, who grew up in a country where a Black president is all she ever knew, right? So she needs to know that the logic still exists in the world. So, yeah, that's definitely not how the conversation leans.
And it's a conversation I don't think most Black parents want to have. I mean,
it's a tough
out of
conversation,
necessity.
as she said,
It's demanded of the society, of the culture. And so I don't think it's tilted, though.
I take this from a different tact. Your question was really interesting to me because my mother is white, right? And she never talked to me about race, right? So I'm biracial, I have a Black father, white mother. Never talked about race. So the poem about the conversation, I never got that, right? And so on some level, that is a little bit problematic, right? And so I would kind of flip the question about how many white parents are having the race conversation with their kids, right? Because that's one aspect of privilege is that you can, my mother said this to me one time when I got older. She said, Elizabeth, I know racism exists, but I can live in a bubble. I don't have to deal with it, right? And so I think that's the other side of the coin is that while, you know, children of color are having these conversations, are white children having these conversations? conversations, and are they having discussions about privilege? And I would agree with the pastors that there probably isn't this discussion of, disliking individual white folks. It's more about an understanding of the world that you operate in. And I don't necessarily think that individuals who experience discrimination are taught to go discriminate against other people, although I understand that does happen sometimes.
Yeah, and also the shame and the guilt, right? That ain't got nothing to do with me. That is how white people particularly, they try to process what has happened to black people in this country. And sometimes they're moved to guilt, sometimes they're not moved to guilt. But one thing, and it's not my job to free any white person of guilt for that. But also, when it comes to having allies, I don't want to alienate allies either. But I also don't want white people serving alongside me, co-laboring alongside me because they feel guilty. Like, I'm not okay with that. I don't want you to be motivated into this work by guilt. Mm-hmm. I want you to be motivated in this work because it's right.
Yes.
Because it's truth, right? So that idea of overcoming the guilt, that's a part of that interior work that I think, men have to do on some extent, but white folk have to do as well. Merton says, if you do not handle the interior life, then you will mess up everything around you. And guilt is often a bad motivator for doing things, right?
And when the guilt is gone, the work is gone.